Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of Season 3 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Melissa Whitecross, coming to you live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Tonight's show is the second in our raptor-themed series, booked for the last Tuesday of every month. A story of the endangered martial eagle and the conservationists working hard to protect them will unfold this evening. We are also very excited to announce a project which we are hatching with the Salati Wilderness Foundation, taking place on Salati Game Reserve. We are in the process of trying to set up a streaming camera service, which will hopefully capture the breeding cycle of their resident pair of martial eagles. We are eagerly awaiting the return of these birds to their nest, and we'll bring you more information on how to subscribe as and when the platform officially launches. But given the martial eagle theme talk this evening, we thought it would be a good idea to just alert you all that this new and exciting endeavor is underway. But let's get on to tonight's webinar. Dr. Gareth Tate is a hardworking, passionate, and experienced raptor biologist who has linked his scientific prowess to his conservation mission to understand and preserve Africa's birds of prey. He holds a PhD from the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town, and followed up his studies with a move to the Endangered Wildlife Trust, where he holds the position of Birds of Prey Program Manager and has done so since 2016. I've had the pleasure of working with Gareth on several raptor conservation projects on a number of different species through the years, and it is an absolute treat to finally have him on the Conservation Conversations show to share his work with us. Gareth, before I put your presentation up, I'm just going to hand over to you to say hello to everybody, and we'll get the show on the road.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm busy sitting here in a very quiet office. I think everyone else has gone home. I'm at the EWT head office in Johannesburg, and I'm really excited to present tonight. All right, good evening, everybody. And it's an absolute pleasure to be part of BirdLife's Conservation Conversations. I was always worried I wasn't going to be able to say that correctly. But yeah, really exciting to be part of this and to present some of our initial findings and just to talk a little bit about the conservation adventure that has been the Karoo Martial Eagle project. And effectively, the project kick-started in 2018, in late 2018, and it's important to note that it built on a significant amount of work that was already established on this pylon nesting population. And that was fundamentally driven by the EWT and Eskom and undertaken by Andrew Jenkins and Koos de Goede and a whole bunch of people that really kind of set the benchmark for the conservation and understanding of this population. I'm just going to turn my video off so it does stream a little bit better. But before I go into the actual presentation, I'd like to just play a little video that we put together that kind of sums up the work and also just show some really great visuals of the project so far. And I hope it streams. It's always a bit brave playing videos, but let's hope that it plays all right. The Great Karoo, home to an extraordinary population of martial eagles that live, breed, and rely on the large power lines that traverse the sparse semi-arid landscape. Are you ready to wake up at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning? I've got a good feeling about this. The trap is right underneath the eagle. Here we go. Looks like he's well trapped. our southernmost bird we've caught, which is pretty cool. But we've been trying for 2 days for this individual, and yeah, he came down into the trap pretty quickly. Yeah, we're going to put a tracking device on him. It's going to form a really important part of the project to understand population dynamics and movements of these birds in the Karoo region. So yeah, really, really stoked. But let's get this bird processed and ringed and tagged. So that kind of sums up a little aspect of the work that we're doing, and it goes without saying, it's been an absolute pleasure working with the species. I remember back in 2012, I was first exposed to martial eagle conservation, and I was first exposed to the conservation status of the species working in Kruger with Rowan van Heerden, and that was the first time I ever got to lay my hands upon a martial eagle. And it's one thing watching them, but I mean, the privilege to be able to actually hold them and, funny enough, even smell them. They smell amazing. They have a very kind of musky, a really nice smell. And it really kind of was one of the catalysts that really drove me to want to work on the species and work towards getting a project set up within the EWT. But back to the presentation and the weird combination of power lines and the Great Karoo. And I bet you a lot of you, if you hadn't seen that video, would be questioning why the combination of the two. And it's really home to an extraordinary population of martial eagles, and something that I did not expect myself. I mean, I've driven throughout the Karoo quite a lot throughout my conservation career, and I've never really noticed that there's a significant population of eagles breeding. And it's not only martial eagles. We'll unpack that a little bit later, but really a remarkable population of eagles that rely and breed on this on the pylons that support these transmission lines that almost run through the country like veins as they move electricity from one major city to the next. If we had to kind of take a step back and look a little bit around the biology of the species, so martial eagles are extremely long-lived, and some of the ringing data and ringing records of the species show that they can live in excess of 30 years old. There was a bird in the Kruger that was actually ringed by one of the section rangers many years ago, and it was actually found electrocuted, and you'll see a picture of it a bit later on. And this bird was estimated to be 32 years old from its ringing data. And as Melissa spoke about a little bit earlier, they're also the heaviest eagle in Africa. They weigh between 5 and 6 kilograms. And in the Karoo, in fact, we've actually caught some of the biggest specimens I've ever seen or ever laid my hands on. They also have an extremely low reproduction rate. So they breed every second year. We have some exceptions to the rule, throwing spanners in the works, but on the most part, they put so much energy and resources into bringing up their chicks that they almost skip a year. And we call it kind of a sabbatical year that the eagles take when they're rearing their young, and then have to take a bit of time out to recoup their energy and fatten up before the next breeding season. So extremely slow reproductive rates. And this is always important to consider when we're thinking about the conservation of the species. And then across their sub-Saharan distribution, they also occur in really low density populations. And you can see, just talking about the size of these birds and talking about the privilege of actually being able to handle these birds. And I must admit, I enjoy holding the birds, but it's never something that I'm, want to really endorse. I'd rather see them flying with their massive wingspan over the African savannah. But, you can just see that the size of these birds, in particular their talons, they're remarkable. And to feel the strength of these birds, you'll see on the picture on the far right, how we actually have to, in some cases, tape up these birds' talons because they can actually cause quite a lot of damage. And reading up about the eagle's strength, they say that the actual crushing force is equivalent to that of a lion's jaws. So they've got remarkable crushing power that they use to take down their prey. Unfortunately, the birds are not in the most convenient, or should I say, are just not in the greatest conservation status in Southern Africa in particular. And in 2015, they were uplisted to locally endangered in South Africa. There is an estimated 800 mature birds. I'm not convinced that this is a very reliable estimate, but still quite concerning and eye-opening that there's about 800 mature birds estimated in Southern Africa. That includes Swaziland. And then even more concerningly is in 2020, in December, the species was uplisted to globally endangered. So the conservation status of this bird is obviously shifting towards that horrible side of the IUCN Red List, towards critically endangered and then of course extinct in the wild. So a very concerning conservation status. In terms of South Africa and their distribution and the reporting rates that we've picked up in the SABAP 1 and SABAP 2, you'll note that there certainly are strongholds for the species in particular areas of South Africa. So the red quadrants effectively show areas where the birds are recorded in higher densities. And you'll see up in the Kruger, that's certainly, I would say, one of the key strongholds for the species. But you'll also see in the center of the country this interesting patch of quite high density sightings of birds. And I'm sure most of you that have spent any bit of time doing bird lassing or doing any form of birding, at some point you'll see a martial eagle. And we'll unpack that a little bit later. So just in terms of their conservation status, and thinking about the SABAP reporting rates, the eagles have shown over the last 20 years or so a concerning decline of around, and this is a uniform decline across Southern Africa, of around 60% over a 20-year period. And what really struck me was that the stronghold populations were the areas where they were actually recording some of the most significant declines. So areas like Kruger National Park, and think about these areas as safe spaces for the species, where threats are, if we think about them in the context of Southern Africa, are remarkably lower than outside of these protected areas. But across areas like Kruger, Galagadi, and Hlahluwi, we saw declines, and these were presented in a couple of research outputs by Klutter and a variety of other researchers. So let's take a little bit of another step back and talk about the biology of the species. So marshals typically, as we all know, traveling through the savanna areas of South Africa, they typically breed and nest in these large trees, and they build these massive nesting platforms, and usually are between 13 and 15 meters high. So it's really important to think about the distribution of the species and their need and requirements to nest on these large trees. However, what we're starting to pick up now is that we're starting to unpack how much these birds are also relying on and nesting on energy infrastructure, in particular the transmission grids that support these transmission lines for Eskom that, as I say, move massive amounts of energy between the major cities. And as you can see, they build these huge nesting platforms inside of most of the time inside of this lattice structure. It's quite convenient for them if you think about the nest site availability and the infrastructure that's there for them to build on. So with this knowledge base that these birds are quite good at breeding on energy infrastructure, a plethora of research was launched to understand the extent and the status of this population that's breeding on infrastructure. And a lot of work was done initially, as I mentioned earlier on, as part of a Eskom funded project. It was called the Electric Eagles Project, and that was conducted by Andrew Jenkins and his team to just start understanding the status and the extent of this population. And then one of the more important outputs, although there were a lot of really great publications that arose from that Electric Eagles Project, and it also fed into a lot of the work that we built on. But one of the important outputs was this estimation and this prediction that was put together by Jessie Burnt as part of her master's thesis that predicted that a third of South Africa's population of martial eagles are in fact breeding and live on these power lines. And that's a really remarkable kind of thing to wrap your head around in terms of the conservation status of the species and their current declines. And another thing to kind of take into consideration is that this population, a large portion of it, falls into the semi-arid, largely treeless landscape. So we've got to start thinking and wrapping our heads around, you know, whether this is a artificial population and how important it is in terms of its conservation status and its impact on the local fauna and the environment and ecosystem that they've effectively moved into. And all of this has been facilitated by these power lines. So building on a really good foundation of work that was done on the eagles, and I got a lot of great data that helped us identify our study sites. So we initiated or launched our Karoo marsh eagle project in 2018 to really understand the dynamics of the population. The long-term sustainability of this population is largely unknown. And I'll explain and unpack that as we go through the presentation and why this is important in the kind of conservation environment that and the nature of the conservation of the species in South Africa. So one thing that is really important to bear in mind is that although these species are now living and breeding on electrical infrastructure in a relatively new environment, if you compare it to their traditional strongholds, they still do face a variety of threats. And what we've picked up since 1996 is that there have in fact been a large amount of mortalities that have been associated with this energy infrastructure. I don't have my notes here, but I think there were well over 100 electrocutions, and I think these red dots, I know these red dots represent electrocutions of marsh eagles across the country on energy infrastructure. And although on the transmission lines, the electrocution risk is quite low, they are being electrocuted on unsafe infrastructure on distribution lines, on the smaller lines that appear like veins in this image. And you'll see there are some collisions that were recorded. And this is only the mortalities or fatalities that were recorded. So now we've got to start thinking about this population and whether it might represent an important source population, sustaining marginal populations. As we know, there are these traditional strongholds that surround this population. Alternatively, on the other hand, it may represent a sink population, so there might be elevated mortality associated with electrocutions that might actually be creating a sink situation where species or populations and birds that are dispersing from the marginal populations are coming into the Karoo, and they are creating this negative dynamic with the population. And this was kind of the fundamentals of the project that we have launched in 2018, is to really start understanding the dynamics of this population. And these are going to be underpinned and unpacked, looking at various elements and various aspects of the species biology in this really unique population. So we really wanted to understand the spatial ecology, the breeding performance and the diet, and then how this feeds into the overall population status. And then, of course, how this all informs the conservation and the mitigation for this particular population. So, as I mentioned, 2018, we teamed up with the Battaliers, and we really initiated our conservation adventure looking at the species across 1,800 kilometers of power line. And it took us about 2 days to traverse these power lines. And at very low flight levels, we would pick up where nests were. They stand out like a sore thumb. And some instances I had to tell the pilot to actually gain altitude because we were flying below the level of the power line. So quite scary. But we would be able to pick up the nests and then take photographs. And what was really cool is that by going and taking the approach of these aerial surveys, we were able to have a really quick snapshot of what the populations were doing. And we were flying and we were undertaking ground surveys, which I'll talk to you a little bit about later. And we were doing about 4 surveys a year. And that enabled us to identify quickly which nests were active and what stage of breeding the particular breeding pair were at. So we could also tell how old chicks were. So with our big lenses and image stabilization in our lenses, and Melissa will mention that there are some really fantastic cameras out there that are able to take some of these photographs. But we were really able to pick up some highly detailed information about what was happening on the nest. You can see in this particular one how much the birds actually defecate on the energy infrastructure. And we also got to think about how this might impact Eskom's infrastructure and have an impact on energy supply. We're also able to pick up really unique things like pellets on the nests, and even what prey items had been stashed on the nest by the adults. So each aerial survey was followed up by a ground survey. And as I say, we undertook 4 surveys per year along this 1,750, 1,800 kilometer section of these power lines. And I'll show you the study site just now. And I must say the ground surveys were slightly more challenging than the aerial surveys. Anyone that has driven Eskom servitudes will know that they are an extreme challenge. I mean, our cars were put to the absolute test, and I've gone through tires and a whole lot of servicing of our vehicles to kind of cope with these really terrible conditions. We spent many nights under the beautiful Karoo sky, probably one of the best in the world in terms of stargazing. We learned very quickly not to camp too close to the power lines because they buzz and they have this horrible kind of, they give off this very horrible energy. You just don't want to be near them. And it's quite remarkable to think that these eagles are actually breeding on these power lines that have extreme electromagnetic and energy fields around them. So we learned very quickly to camp further away from the power lines when we were out in the field. And yes, a lot of our work was made easier by some of the equipment that we were sponsored. So AliCab have really helped us, but we spent a significant amount of time in our vehicles. They became our offices away from home. And that was a kind of a before picture of what my back of my bucky looked like before we had some really great equipment sponsored. So this is effectively the study site. And what we picked up was, building on the databases that were provided to us, we were quickly able to establish this really remarkable setup of nests along these transmission lines that run pretty much from Cape Town all the way through to Dar, and then in a northwesterly direction all the way up to Kenhardt, and then westerly down to the west coast of South Africa, west coast of the Western Cape. And as I mentioned, we traversed about 1,750 kilometers of line. We picked up 187 large eagle nests. So this is pretty much a nest every 10 kilometers. It's truly remarkable. And to see the face of Rowan van Eden, who did his PhD on martial eagles in the Kruger, to see his face and his eyes when we flew over, we took him on one of the aerial surveys. He was just mind blown, and he couldn't believe how important this population is. So a whole bunch of nests picked up along our surveys. And as I mentioned, not only martial eagles, we picked up quite a few tawny eagles. And subsequently, there has been work initiated on understanding this Karoo population. Nothing's really known in terms of their breeding and their movements. And then our really kind of Karoo flagship species, the rose eagles, we also found to nest on power lines, which I've always found quite interesting, being cliff breeders. It's remarkable to see them moving onto the power lines. That I would choose a cliff any day over a power line. And what was really unique about our setup is also being part of the project in Kruger National Park is we really struggled to understand the nesting setup and territories in the Kruger National Park because it's such thick bush. We know we can find an active nest, but we don't necessarily record all the nests in a territory. And it's important to know that eagles often build backup nests, alternative nests in their territory. So in the Karoo setup, we were able to actually draw a buffer around the nest, and then we were able to systematically search that area, which enabled us to really identify the full extent of a pair's territory. And that allowed us to monitor 50 pairs intensively. And I don't think many natural setups allow us to kind of really monitor an eagle species on that level where we know where all the nests are. And it's important because we might capture a breeding failure in one year, but it might just be because the birds have moved to an alternative nest through disturbance or whatever it may be. So we were able to kind of really intimately identify breeding pairs and their associated territories. Talking about intimate, we really developed a great data set. So we were able to monitor pairs, and as I say, we really focused on 50, where we did four surveys a year to look at the beginning phases of breeding all the way through to fledgling their chicks. So we had a really intimate understanding of the breeding pairs in the Karoo, and then we were also able to understand the breeding schedule. And as I mentioned, these birds breed every second year, so it was really nice to look at this fluctuation between birds breeding and not breeding. So every second year, it was really interesting to see when pairs would breed and how they would almost temporarily avoid each other in pairs that were close to each other. They would avoid breeding in the same year. It's really super interesting. We only really started to unpack that. Although our results are by no means final, we still got a lot of analyses to do. One of the kind of key preliminary results was that we picked up quite a high productivity, and I know that 0.37 may not appear to be high, but that is effectively 0.37 chicks per pair per year. A bit of a mouthful, but that's almost double that of Kruger. Kruger, I think at the moment, I must double check with my colleagues, but it's around 0.19, 0.25. It's extremely low, and if for a pretty stronghold safe space of Kruger, you would expect it to be a lot higher. So the Karoo population have a very interesting breeding performance, and that's something that we're really analyzing. Another big part of our work was to understand the spatial ecology of the species, and there's no better way to do that than to fit our study species with tracking devices. And these high resolution tracking units, we'll start talking a little bit about them a bit later, but before we get to that, I don't think I ever considered the amount of time we would spend trapping birds, and it's one of the steepest learning curves I've ever undertaken. And we spent a significant amount of time sitting in this little hide waiting for the eagles, and they say the most important part of trapping eagles, you have to be cleverer than the eagles. And we were kind of dumbstruck for the first few months, because on our first trip we spent 2 weeks trying to catch eagles and we only caught one. So it's a massive learning curve, and I won't go into too much detail around the actual trapping techniques, but we spent 212 hours, and this is only from when I started actually recording our time in the hide, catching eagles to fit these birds with tracking devices. And we also had to fine-tune our techniques, and we also had to do the most ethical methods of fitting the harnesses. And there's often questions around, aren't you interfering with the aerodynamics of the bird, and they're long-lived, is it really ethical to put tracking devices on them for long term? And so we had to really test out, and we did a lot of our testing of the tracking devices in captivity. We even fitted birds that we had found dead under power lines, etc., just so we could really fine-tune this technique. And we also, which I think is really important, we fit these birds with a weak link in their harnesses. So you'll see in the picture in the middle, we put these, we use cotton, and we put about 4 or 5 knots, and these wear down slowly over time, and they fall off the eagles. Usually after 3 or 4 years, it's still a bit of a method in practice, and we have had tags fall off successfully after 4 or 5 years. So it's just to make sure that these birds do not sit with these devices for the rest of their lives. So a lot of effort, and I think taking on this project was almost pretty much on the level of a PhD, but we had an amazing team of people with us, and we caught, altogether we caught 20 birds. And as you can see in these pictures, we caught a variety of different age classes, from youngsters, that had recently fledged, through to sub-adults, and then a handful of adults. And quite interestingly, that bird in the bottom right is actually a bird that is pushing into, you know, adult plumage, and it's still considered a sub-adult, but that bird in fact bred. So we're picking up really kind of small, intimate details around the species that, you know, we don't really get to pick up without these captures and tagging. So these devices, as I mentioned, are incredibly high resolution. We're able to collect thousands of observations over large temporal and spatial scales. And this allows us to start really answering really key questions around the species in a new landscape, such as the Karoo. And you cannot collect this kind of information through direct observations. With the tracking devices, we're able to look at how the birds interact with the landscape, where they thermal, where they hunt, where they breed, you know, where their core habitat is. And as you'll see, you know, as we start analyzing this, we can start using this data and this information to really translate it into conservation of the species and really unpack some of the more core questions around how we protect the species and what their threats are in the landscape. So, as I mentioned, we've now caught to date 20 individuals, and you'll see their names are quite normally named after the farmer. And that often helps with the conservation of the species, because the farmers always want to know where their birds are and how they're doing. And then we get to monitor them. And I think it's one of the coolest parts of my job is that we get to monitor our birds in almost real time. And all of these birds feed into monitoring software, Earth Ranger. And every morning I can see how they're doing, whether they're breeding perhaps, and whether there might be any mortalities. And that's a very important part of the project, is we want to understand what the drivers are behind mortalities in South Africa. So as soon as a bird stops moving, we can follow up and we can look at what the cause of mortality was. In the cases so far, we've actually found a couple of birds that were poisoned. I won't talk too much about that, but we had a bird poisoned in the Eastern Cape, unfortunately. And then also we've had birds that were shot, and some birds that just disappeared off the face of the planet, where we were either a tag failure or we were actually unsure. You know, it might be the tag might have been destroyed, but that's a lot of speculation behind that. So we now are building this really great knowledge base of how these birds operate in the Karoo landscape, and we'll talk a little bit about how much they rely on energy infrastructure. You'll see that we can start picking up similarities between how adults and juveniles behave in both the Karoo population and comparative populations in the Kruger, where we are studying, also studying tracking and home range use and spatial ecology of the species in partnership with the University of Cape Town and Hawkwatch International. But we can also start looking at how big these home ranges are in some of the individuals. You'll see on the right-hand side around Lesotho, those are some of our younger birds, which have these dispersal ranges that are as big as 33,000 square kilometers, massive dispersal ranges. And this is also helping us wrap our heads around how important they are in terms of recruitment into these marginal populations. So they definitely have the capability of traveling and sustaining marginal populations. And then, of course, looking at the adults, how they typically stick to their home ranges, and how they highly territorial, and they almost beautifully organized within the landscape spatially. And we could almost put a ruler or we can measure between each nest, and almost all the time we would have about an 8-kilometer minimum distance between active nests. In home range size, something that was never known about the Karoo marsupial population is approximately 295 square kilometers. Interestingly, just immediately comparing this to the Kruger birds, it's almost a third less, the average home ranges. And I've also got to wrap my head around home ranges, because I had a workshop last week with the Max Planck Institute, and they kind of changed my way how we think around home ranges. It's more the occurrence distributions. So we got to think about how we use this data and information. And as I mentioned, extremely large dispersal ranges. As these juveniles are finding their legs or finding their wings, they are looking for the most ideal places to hunt, and also to make sure that they're away from adults, because as I say, adults are extremely territorial, and we've actually seen them fight to the death. So they are extremely territorial. And then, of course, starting to look at how they interact with energy infrastructure and what their habitat selection is in this landscape. And it's quite interesting to see how much these animals depend on the power lines. I haven't actually included this in this presentation, but I found that these birds spend over 90% of their time perching, doing nothing on Eskom power lines. So it's incredible how much they depend on these power lines. And you can see the further away you move from these power lines, the less likely you're going to actually see the birds. They're less likely to occur further away from power lines. And this is just looking at the other habitat classes, and second class in terms of where these birds are selecting to spend their time on are plantations, which are also artificial in many a sense. For those of you that have spent time in the Karoo, you'll see that there are often these patches of trees and eucalyptus gum trees or poplar trees, and that these birds are spending quite a bit of time in, which is kind of brings them a little bit back more towards their natural behavior. And then really important component of this work, you'll see all these black parcels that you see along our study sites represent the farm portions that we work on. And we work with over 250 farmers that obviously intersect with the power lines. And a very important part of this work has been engagement with these landowners and talking about some of their struggles they have with the eagles. And they are complex and more dynamic than you can ever imagine. And they extend far more than beyond human-wildlife conflict, where eagles are taking livestock. You know, we are now exposed to a new kind of threat where wind farms, eagles obviously prevent wind farms being developed close to the nest. We often have an industry standard of 5-kilometer buffers in terms of placing turbines around an active nest. And what we're finding is that the farmers are now losing out on having wind farms put on their properties, and they can obviously benefit from an income from those turbines. And they're now actually persecuting eagles so that the wind farms can go ahead. So it's a very complex thing. I don't want to get into it. Also quite controversial, but we're working a lot with these farmers. We're providing them with extensive information. I think we've handed out over 200 of these really cool pamphlets that we put together, and just all around helping landowners deal with conflict situations and also raise awareness for this incredible species, and talk about how important this pylon population really is. A really important part of our project is also to look at the prey base and the diet of marsh eagles in the Karoo population. We've only just started working on analyzing prey remains. We've got well over 2,000 prey remains, so we need to get a student on board to help us analyze this. So if there's anyone out there, you know, willing to come and help us, we do need a student. But we really want to understand what the prey base is, and then what the potential impact that marshes might have. But I don't think we even consider that. If you think about some of the really enigmatic, important rare species of the Karoo, riverine rabbits, or Ludwig's bustards, etc., are these birds having an impact on the local fauna? And also, how are they competing and interacting with the local species such as Verreaux's eagles? So yeah, it's really important to talk about how this may benefit Eskom, and obviously this project is fundamentally funded and supported by Eskom. So we've developed this really awesome relationship with Eskom, and not only is this the opportunity to undertake really novel research on a new population, but we can also help Eskom identify the eagle's impact on energy infrastructure, and of course how this might affect the supply of energy. As you can see, these birds, they build these large nesting structures, and we have seen outages and fires, and we need to work with Eskom to develop management plans so that they can cope and manage the eagles on their power lines, whether it comes to moving nests or mitigating issues, or even if it just comes down to the protection of these birds and disturbance, making sure that they're doing maintenance in certain times of the year, etc. And then a really cool output from this project, which we really didn't have as a core mandate, but is starting to look at collision and electrocution risk in the species. And we are leaning on our colleagues at the University of Cape Town to really assist us with this. But effectively, what we've seen is, and what we've identified is that there are these big 5 collision-prone species across South Africa. And I'm talking about collisions with wind turbines, and there's this real critical need for developing sensitivity mapping that can help us guide and inform wind farms where and when not to place turbines. And effectively, with tracking data, we can really inform that, and we can produce really robust models that predict where high-risk areas are for these eagles. And we're going to be taking this forward with the University of Cape Town and build on a similar project like Vera, which was the Vero's Eagle Risk Assessment, which predicted collision risk in Vero's eagles. And it's a super tool for wind energy development. So we also got to take a bit more of a holistic approach and look on these pylon nesting marsh eagles. And we often have farmers say, well, they're effectively an artificial population, and a lot of biologists and researchers saying, well, these pylons have facilitated this range expansion into this treeless landscape. But we truly are, and we need to kind of change our mindset to really accept that this is a remarkable population of high conservation value and importance. And that makes Eskom the custodians of these nesting marsh eagles that are breeding on the pylons. And this obviously has a lot of implications around how we manage and conserve this population. So we are working on a variety of outputs now, and we've just partnered up with University of Cape Town with Dr. Arjun Amar and master student Jane Doherty, and she's going to be looking at unpacking the analysis to really develop this understanding of the dynamics of this population, whether they're a source or a sink, and look at the parameters for population viability analysis, and then model the growth rate of this population. And then, of course, that's going to answer a lot of really key fundamental questions for us. And of course, a lot of this is going to be translated into direct conservations for the species. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I don't know how long I've been. I hope I didn't push it too long, but I really have a lot of people to thank for this project. Meg and Devin and Rowan and a whole bunch of other people. Then obviously my team, John and Lindy. It's been really great working. And then of course the Karoo farmers that have on the odd occasion pulled out a gun when they didn't know when we didn't really communicate properly with them. That was just it's very important to make sure that you let people know that you're working on their farms. But yeah, it's been an absolutely amazing learning curve and an amazing conservation adventure. And I can't wait for the outputs so that we can really conserve the species more holistically and effectively. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was an extremely impressive presentation. Lots of incredible science going in to fuel your conservation efforts. And it's so great yet again to see an organization like Eskom putting in all of the effort to try and understand these birds that are interacting with their infrastructure. So a massive kudos to you and the team, and well done for this really, really impressive project that you guys are undertaking, and all the best with the future research. We've got tons of questions coming in, Gareth, so I don't know if you want to pop your video on to join me, and we can start getting through some of these. We'll, there we go, hello. We'll start off with one from Jonathan Stacey. He said you mentioned 800 mature birds in South Africa. Do we have estimates for Southern Africa as a region?
We don't. I don't think there's been enough research to quantify and establish the status of the species across their distribution in the Southern African distribution. So that's why you saw in my presentation I wasn't 100% entirely convinced by the current estimates, and that's why this kind of research is so important, that we can really consolidate and combine these projects in Kruger and the Karoo and the surrounds to really understand the real number and how that informs the conservation status.
Absolutely. And it was really interesting seeing your sort of layout of these birds and how they're using that electrical infrastructure across those open landscapes in the Karoo. Lisa Newfin's with us this evening, and she asked whether in your surveys through the Karoo you found any birds on natural nests, if we can call them that, with these plantation birds.
Absolutely, there are the odd pair breeding on eucalypts and poplar trees, and they're actually quite a few nests that we don't even we can't expand our focus onto these kind of tree nesting and some birds also nesting on distribution lines. We've had to really kind of just use our transmission line birds as a representative of the Karoo population. But I think if we start looking on trees and stuff, we'll find a lot more. In fact, we've even found marshes on cliffs, breeding on cliffs. And I don't know how that comes about. Maybe they usurp or take over Verreaux's eagle nest, but it's super cool. I really can't wait to lay my eyes upon one. I haven't seen one yet, a cliff nesting pair.
Absolutely, yeah, that is absolutely fascinating, and it would be interesting to see if they are, as you say, usurping their conspecifics out in the Karoo, those Verreaux's that have dominated that landscape. While we briefly touching on plantations, and I know this is the question that all raptorbiologists dread, we've seen plantations form a massive support to a lot of our birds of prey. What is your take on these eucalypts that get a bad rap and cause a lot of trouble for our water security in terms of looking at the conservation of our birds of prey and how we deal with that?
Sure, it's interesting. I did my PhD on black spars that have had their range expanded by the presence of eucalypts. So they certainly have the potential to sustain populations. What we are seeing, unfortunately, is we are seeing kind of range expansions of species such as red or rufous-breasted spars into areas where they're taking on more kind of endemic prey where they shouldn't really be. So I think it's an interesting kind of quite a complex question, but they certainly have a potential to sustain populations. I would, with the replacement of or the removal of large plantation or large forests, such as your yellowwoods, etc., where they actually provided a nesting opportunity many years ago, they've been removed, and in that kind of sense, these exotic trees certainly they're filling that role, but we do have to kind of watch it carefully in terms of how they might be introducing species into areas where they shouldn't really be, where they have an impact on local species.
Absolutely, and I think one of the best examples of species that have been introduced that we would rather not have would be something like a pied crow. And Robert Smith was asking, have you seen any predation of your Pylon martial eagles by pied crows?
One thing I can tell you is that there is an extensive amount of harassing from crows. Crows harass marshals like you cannot believe. I haven't seen any predation, but I've seen them, adults bring in food to chicks and have there's about 50 crows swarm around these eagles and stop them kind of performing their daily activities. So they swab and they mob, not swab. They mob and really cause a lot of grief for the eagles, and that's for sure. And I'm pretty certain that if they chased off the nest, the crows will peck at and destroy an egg. That's certainly possible.
Sure. Yeah, certainly something we're all looking at with trepidation. But there was a question, or at least you touched on sort of food sources, and you guys are just starting to unpack this. And you mentioned one of the birds you recovered had likely been shot. Are you seeing some human-wildlife conflict with this expansion into a largely agricultural community?
Absolutely. There's certainly, they've got a bit of a bad rap for taking lambs, and although I haven't seen hard evidence and videos or anything, I don't deny it. But one thing that I can say is out of all the nests we monitor, there were probably 5 pairs that regularly had lambs under their nest. So if we're talking, over 80 pairs, only 5, a very small proportion of them actually convincingly leaving remains, under their nests. It says quite a lot in terms of how much they actually do predate on lambs. And then there's always the thing, and I've seen this with my own eyes, is that they often feed on dead lambs already. So they do scavenge to a degree. So but they definitely have a bad rap, and they are shot, and in some cases they are poisoned. I don't see any other reason for an eagle being poisoned in other than human-wildlife conflict.
Thanks, Gareth. And just touching on, you showed some of the other power line nesting birds. We had a question in the chat box earlier. I can't remember who it was, apologies, but they were asking if you ever picked up any vultures trying to nest on these large transmission structures.
That's super interesting. No, not yet. We've seen a very weird southerly shift in vulture distributions, particularly in summer when they're moving away from their breeding sites into areas such as the Kenhardt, Brunfley, the Bushman land area. And on our surveys, we're actually flying over vultures that are roosting on these pylons in massive numbers. I mean, over 300 birds. The one day we recorded over 30 lappets in an area where they weren't really seen since the 1970s. So there is a weird thing happening in terms of vultures using this landscape and obviously roosting extensively on these sites, but nothing in terms of breeding. We have seen it in Northwest and in some parts of the Northern Cape, more towards the Kalahari. We've seen them nesting on, but never taking over a marshal nest.
Brilliant. And I know Sven Creer is a watcher of the show. He heads up the Bacheliers, and it's great to see that you guys have been able to partner with them. We had a question from Marty asking whether there were any risks of bird strikes while you guys were flying so close to those nests, and did you have any close calls while you were flying?
We've had one interesting thing happen, and it's happened in Kruger too, where the birds take on the aircraft. They actually leave the nesting platform and they come straight, they beeline for the aircraft. But most of the time, I think we're moving too fast. I think we're going around 80 knots, which is quite slow for the aircraft we're using. Unfortunately, helicopters were just too expensive. It would be great to take a helicopter, but we've had no near strikes. We've had birds come to a helicopter, actually take on a helicopter that was hovering above a nest, recording what was going on in the nest. So they're quite brave.
Indeed. But all right, we're gonna segue off to another common theme as I scroll through all of these many questions, Gareth. And this might be something that's maybe more tuned to Lawrence Levenar in the WEP program, but we're getting a lot of questions around the sort of proposed buffers around these structures and potential wind farms and power lines. How is the information that you're collecting feeding into that? And are we looking at a mirror similar to the Vera? And what's sort of the next steps in terms of guiding development in Africa and the rollout of electrical infrastructure?
I think the first output that will be important in terms of wind development and guiding and informing renewable energy is that there currently aren't really any plans for or guidelines for marsh eagles and renewable energy. So UCT have been working on a paper that will help us have more robust buffer size or point towards more robust buffer sizes. What we are doing is that we've had initial chats around developing a mirror. So also a marshal eagle risk assessment that will hopefully be kind of the ultimate guideline for where to place wind turbines. So that's one of the important ones. And then also developing more robust buffers and looking at other mitigation options such as black blade painting, radar, shutdown on demand, etc.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, that's great, and I think so needed. As you said, it's one of the big five, and we've seen some scary stats coming out on birds like the black harrier. So we certainly need to get all the information that we can. In terms of, I'm just having a look here. I think we've answered this one from Karen with that, so I'll carry on then. You spoke about sleeping near the power lines, and Di Jago has mentioned how uncomfortable sleeping near power lines can be. You mentioned that these birds are having quite high productivity rates, which I found very interesting given some of the research that's out there around kind of electromagnetic impacts on breeding and that sort of thing. Do you have any takes on the electromagnetic impacts? Are you guys trying to potentially look at that? Yeah, is there any work being done on this electromagnetic effect?
Nothing. I mean, it could certainly be the next wave of research that we do. But I think first of all, we want to see what their breeding performance is. And if their breeding performance is high, then it may not be an aspect that we really need to look at. But we are finding indications that they do breed well, despite being in, from what we've seen, is pretty drought-stricken areas and low prey bases. I think, as you know, they just with that insane eyesight that they have, they're obviously spotting prey far away, and the Karoo kind of really lends to a what's the word, a favorable landscape for them. So yeah, but we'll unpack that all.
Definitely. And obviously, as you said, we've spoken a bit about diet. From a conservation point of view, we know this is an endangered raptor, and Lisa's once again highlighting it's great that we're seeing an endangered bird expand into another threatened landscape, but how do we trade off kind of the threats that this threatened raptor could potentially pose to other sensitive populations? I know the EWT does extensive work on riverine rabbit and other creatures in the Karoo. How are you guys weighing up these new apex predators in the landscape?
So I'm quite nervous as we embark on our prey analysis in terms of maybe finding a riverine rabbit. I might have to hide that data from the riverine rabbit team at our drylands conservation program. But certainly that's what we need to look at, and we have to really take every single element in terms of the species and their potential impact. So that's all going to be unpacked by this work, and in a way that we haven't really done before. So the same with Ludwig's bustards. You know, we're seeing such high collisions on energy infrastructure, and I'm still kind of baffled how they persisting in South Africa, because working on marshals, you just find hundreds and hundreds of carcasses under the power line. So, you know, having an additional threat and risk such as a predation from marshals, it's certainly something to consider.
Definitely. And just to loop back to where these birds are breeding, Chris Van Rooyen mentioned that they're finding several nests on the rocky outcrops in the Karoo. So getting back to your semi-cliff nesting birds, they seem to be adapting to that. I'm not sure if you encountered any sort of rocky outcrop bird nests.
No, I saw a nest. I found a nest on a quiver tree, which was quite cool because it's very low. It's about 2-3 meters off the ground, and that was in a very rocky outcrop. So they seem to be really filling the landscape. And as I say, it's just remarkable how they partition themselves and package themselves spatially into the landscape. It's super cool.
Absolutely, yeah, and that really intensive survey effort that you guys have put in is fascinating. I know places like Kruger's marshals have been extensively studied, and Penny is asking whether areas like the Kalahari, which are probably your closest non-heavily power-lined landscape, have been equally intensively monitored.
So there's been quite a lot of historical work done on areas such as the Kalahari, but nothing current. It certainly warrants some work. We did start some surveys last year in Kalahari, just road surveys, but it's definitely a population to keep our eyes on, and then yeah, that certainly is the most, in terms of proximity, is the closest population to the one we were monitoring. So it might be an important one to understand in terms of sustaining or you know, birds moving between the two populations. So that might be really interesting.
Fantastic. And I saw in one of your photos there you had some alphanumeric rings on the legs of one of the birds. Have you put alphanumeric rings on most of your Karoo birds? And is there somewhere our viewers, if they're out and about and happen to come across one of your birds, could potentially upload that information for you?
Yeah, so that was actually one of UCT's birds, Meg, sorry, that was actually a Kruger photo, but we have put a couple of colorings on our birds. We've got one resighting, but it's definitely important to get the news out there that we have some ring birds. Our rings are green and blue. So if you do see green or blue rings, that would be great. Especially in the Kenhardt area, they're all green. And then in the Victoria West, the R area, they are blue.
And can people just get in touch with you, Gareth, if they find them?
yeah, I'll be very, very excited if I get a resighting.
Fantastic. That's Gareth T at ewt.org.za. Fantastic. Well, Gareth, I think I'm going to call it there because we've been having some great discussions here, but we can't get to all of them. Apologies, everybody. But thank you so much. That really outstanding presentation, fantastic work being done, and certainly lots more to learn about these incredible raptors. Thank you for all the effort that you put into tonight's show. I really do appreciate it, and I'm sure all of our audience have loved hearing more about the Martial Eagles. Before I close up, is there anything else you'd like to share with everybody, or any last closing sentiments?
No, just thanks for having me, and yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to share our work.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Gareth. As you can see, everybody, next week we are back to our AV tourism series. It's birding Gauteng. Do not miss this one. It's going to be brilliant. Dylan Vas-Poli's with us, one of the top birders in South Africa, and certainly going to be a fun and interesting evening. Lots more to share with you in the upcoming month. Thank you all so much for joining us. And as always, we'll be back 7 o'clock every Tuesday on Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. Thanks for spending your Tuesday night with us. Keep your eyes on the skies, keep enjoying those birds, and I will see you all next week, Tuesday. Good night, everyone, and enjoy your evening.